And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to be talking with Trent Horn about, this really interesting phenomenon. Sometimes when you talk to Protestants, their argumentation sounds an awful lot like the non-believers give. And sometimes when you talk to non-believers, it sounds an awful lot like some of the argumentation you hear from, say, fundamentalist, Baptist, young earth type people. Is there a mirror quality about this? What's going on with that? Well, that's the topic of Trent's new book, When Protestants Argue Like Atheists, 13 Weird Ways That Anti-Catholics Mimic Secular Skeptics. And Trent Horn, welcome back to Hands-On Apologetics.
Thank you very much for having me, Gary.
Yeah. So, you know what? I got to congratulate you. You just recently had a debate with Gavin Ortlund, and you made a move in your opening statement that I thought was brilliant. And I watched some reviews, post-debate reviews, and they seem to have missed that. But you pointed out that you kind of warned Gavin not to argue like atheist when it comes to sola scriptura. And I thought that was an awesome asymmetrical move on your part. Because, the standard argument for sola scriptura often is a lot like a naturalist argument against the supernatural. And that fits perfectly with your book. So, great debate, by the way.
Absolutely. When the newer argument for sola scriptura, because you would have probably in the 90s and early 2000s, Protestants would try to make a more forceful argument saying the Bible teaches sola scriptura. They would use Greek exegesis of 2 Timothy chapter 3. But even Gavin himself admits, no, that you can't really get a direct biblical proof. So he uses this more indirect argument. It's a very subtle argument to say, all right, look, the Bible is an infallible rule of faith, and no other infallible rules of faith have been proven to exist. So we're justified in believing the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith. And at first you think, I guess that kind of makes sense, but you don't realize this is a fallacious argument from ignorance. And I'm glad you cover logical fallacies on your show. Yeah. All that proves is we don't know if there are other infallible rules beyond Scripture. If you even start with this premise, which itself is problematic, like how do you even know what Scripture is? But moving beyond that, say, all right, that is, and I point out in my book, and I pointed out in the debate, that this is the same thing as when atheists say, all right, we all agree the natural world exists. Nothing beyond the natural has been proven to exist. Therefore, only the natural world exists, so we should be atheists or naturalists. To which you would respond, no, that proves agnosticism. We don't know if there's a reality beyond the natural. Not atheism or naturalism. You have a burden of proof to share. And so in my book, I actually quote from when James White debated Pat Madrid on sola scriptura. And when you listen to him, he sounds like a lot of atheists. That White says, the less honest debater might attempt to force me to prove the non-existence of another rule of faith, since I'm saying Scripture is unique in its function. And he then goes on to say, that's like trying to prove there's no other pen like this one. Well, that's the same thing. That's what atheists do when they say, you can't, if you're being a Christian, you can't ask me to prove God does not exist. You can't ask me to prove the non-existence of God. If you can't prove God exists, then I win. Protestants do the same thing. If you can't prove the church is an infallible rule of faith, then I win. It really is, by framework, the exact same argument.
Yeah, absolutely. And brilliant move. That's a legendary exchange between Madrid and White on the pen. And it's something common. I mean, in your book, you go through a number of different ways in which Protestants argue like atheists or atheists argue like Protestants. And
yes,
I found that to be causes some consternation with atheists when you tell them, the young earthers, they make the same kind of argument, and It's essentially the same structures.
Exactly. And I'm actually really jazzed, Gary, to be talking to you about this book, being that you're a veteran of doing apologetics, of doing debates. You have seen this firsthand. So, for example, I was watching The Dividing Line recently, and James White was having a little bit of fit over my tactic in the Ortland debate and what I've been saying about this. He says Catholics are saying Protestants argue like atheists. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And he said, I debated Gary Machuda on the Deuterocanon, and I pointed out there's historical inaccuracies in the Apocrypha. And Gary tells me that's how atheists argue. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. No, White, that exactly is. That is the exact same argument. And this is the one that boggles me the most, and I've heard it multiple times from particular brands of Protestants. They reject the Apocrypha. Well, clearly it's not inspired because it has errors in it. How do you know they have errors? Well, look at it. It's obviously an error. Yet they rebuke atheists who have that attitude towards Scripture, towards the proto-canon. If an atheist says, look, it obviously is an error in this proto-canonical book, a Protestant apologist say, well, no, it's an alleged error. Even if we don't know how to resolve it, it doesn't prove that it is an error. Yet they won't extend the same courtesy to the Deuterocanon, not by a long shot.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't know he mentioned me in that. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it was like a few weeks ago, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I did get a weird chill, a couple of weeks ago, so maybe that's
right.
Like a premonition. But yeah, exactly. It's like a double standard based on your presuppositions going into the argument. So,
and my point in bringing this up also is not to just rip on Protestants. Like in the book, I talk about where Catholics can make these similar errors. It's more out of concern to say, look, if you're using these approaches to try to refute Catholicism, the same exact approach can be retrofitted to refute Christianity. So, it's like you burn down the house to kill the spider. It's like, was it really worth it for you to try to disprove Catholicism, to use a methodology that would also disprove Christianity itself? That's the question I have for Protestants who use these methods.
Yeah. In fact, Edward Roos noted that, that critical things that were being used on Tobit would eventually undermine Jonah,
Right.
And so once you open that door in principle, you can't shut it again.
Right.
Yeah. So you handle Protestants who argue along the same lines as atheists that argue along the same line as Protestants. Also, Catholics, occasionally will also get into the mix. So how did you come up with the idea for the book? Was this something that was percolating for a while?
Well, I talk about this in the introduction of the book. I was being interviewed by Cameron Bertuzzi for Capturing Christianity when I did a debate in 2021 for his conference. I debated Ben Watkins from Real Atheology. We did an atheism debate. And he was interviewing me about Catholicism beforehand. And when he was asking me questions, he would ask me questions like, well, shouldn't we at least say Protestantism is more likely to be true because it's a simpler hypothesis than Catholicism? And I saw Ben over in the corner, who was the atheist who's there to debate me later, who's going to be interviewed by Cameron as well. And I said, wait, that's like something Ben would say to me. Like, shouldn't we agree atheism is more likely to be true because it's a simpler hypothesis than theism? We're postulating less entities, so it's more likely to be true. And so I said in reply to Cameron that even if that were the case, just because something is simpler, it might raise more questions than it solves, and you'll have more problems in that. But I also am not sure it's even simpler if we look at it in that way. And that got the ball thinking in my head, hey, wait, this all sounds really familiar. So I did a few podcast episodes. I sat down and thought about these similarities. I did like about two podcast episodes on them. And then, I just started writing it down and noticing them. And I think the reason this happens is because the debate between Christians and atheists is similar in structure to the debate between Protestants and Catholics. And it basically goes like this. So Protestants and atheists would say, look, we have this body of knowledge or facts that we agree. Why do we need anything beyond this? For atheists, it's the natural world. For Protestants, it's Scripture. Why do we need anything else? This suffices for what we need to know. Catholics and the Christian will tell the atheist, no, the natural world doesn't suffice because you don't have an explanation for the natural world itself. You need something beyond it. You need God to fully explain the natural world and give it meaning. And Catholics would say to Protestants, well, no, Scripture doesn't explain itself. You need an infallible authority to understand, well, what is Scripture? What about things that have been revealed that are not explicit in Scripture? To which then in reply, atheists will say to Christians, No, we don't need God. It explains itself. Or, you know what? God and religion has contradictions. It has absurdities. Your theory makes it worse. And then Protestants will say to Catholics, no, Scripture explains itself. That's all we need. And your Catholic Church just adds contradictions and absurdities into the mix. So because the structure is similar, I notice similar methodologies are used as a result between the parties.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, that it also kind of addressed a question I was going to ask you is, the ultimate cause of these similarities and arguments, because I noticed that right with the new atheists when they came on the scene, a lot of the arguments a lot of them were former Protestants.
Yes.
And they just it seemed like they just took the stock anti-Catholic arguments and just broadened it to include all of Christianity.
Well, they do, because many of the arguments that Protestants use against Catholicism, they do mirror the atheistic arguments, because a lot of what Protestants argue against Catholicism is a brand of skepticism. It's to say, well, I don't think this passage really teaches the papacy, and I don't think this is really present among the historical fathers. This is especially true in chapter 8 of my book, Demystifying the Miraculous, where I cover B.B. Warfield, a well-known Calvinist scholar from Princeton theologian from the early 20th century. And Warfield, was a cessationist. He didn't believe miracles continued after the apostolic age. So he does a whole book debunking miracles after the apostolic age. And he acts just like an atheist. In fact, in my book, let me see here. I should have a quote here. I think a lot of the similarities arise, and why some Protestants become atheists is because Protestantism focuses more on skeptical attacks against Catholicism than building a positive case for Protestantism, frankly. Like when I ask people, why are you Protestant? They'll just say, well, because I don't believe in this Catholic doctrine or that Catholic doctrine. Instead of a positive, here is why I believe these Protestant doctrines. It's just, well, if Catholicism loses, Protestantism wins. And they're used to having the skepticism. But you can't always turn the skepticism off, because then you turn it towards the Bible and Christianity itself. And you say, if Christianity loses, atheism wins with that attitude. And as I said, this is especially clear in Benjamin Warfield's early 20th century work. He's a Protestant Princeton Calvinist theologian. Counterfeit miracles. So he denied miracles after the apostolic age, and he tries to explain away all of them. And so what about the miracles of the saints? Well, he says Catholic medieval miracle stories, they come from, quote, the thought of an age so little instructed in the true character of the forces of nature, and especially its deeply seated conception of the essentially magical nature of religion and its modes of working. And he says Lourdes is because of suggestion. He goes on. And I point out in my book, if you just take out Catholic and put in Christian, he sounds like Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, right.
These are people who, the saint miracles, these are people who didn't understand how nature works. And to which later then I quote a Protestant scholar, Philip Barnes, reviewing Warfield, saying that the problem here, he writes, is that if the same considerations adduced by Warfield in his dismissal of post-apostolic miracles were applied to some biblical stories, then a similar negative verdict would be required in the latter cases as the former. And that's Barnes, who was a Protestant reviewer of Warfield. I think it was an 85 journal article he wrote that. So that's where I go through to show, look, this skeptical approach, we're going to, drill down and not be charitable towards the evidence that's presented. It will eventually catch up to you in your own faith.
Yeah. So there's a kind of red line, when it comes to skepticism, that you go up to a point, but your faith won't allow you to go even further. And then it seems that, when people's faith are shaken, then that red line disappears and they just apply skepticism universally throughout all their beliefs.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So how much skepticism is too much skepticism, I guess, with ultimate. But, on the other hand, Trent, as Catholics, I think it's important for us to be skeptical, too. Let's take miracles. We need to be skeptical if there's a miracle claim, because we don't want to assign something that's purely human to God unless it really does come from God.
And that's why I argue in the book that the goal should be that we use an equal standard to judge any truth claim. So we just judge them all equally and see what passes the test in that regard. The problem becomes if you use unequal standards in this respect. So one element where I do find a really interesting inconsistency, this is in chapter 11 of my book, is when you'll have Protestant apologists. Well, I guess there's two elements here. First, I want to talk about the issue of apologists versus scholars. Okay, so you'll note the different standards of evidences here. So a lot of times when you or I will make a case, let's say for a first century bishop of Rome, for example, make a case for that. You'll have Protestants will say, oh, that's just what Catholic apologists say. Catholic scholars admit the episcopacy formed later in church history, and the scholars aren't like apologists. They just follow the evidence, and we should listen to them, these Catholic historical scholars, not the apologists, things like that. But then Protestants will try to argue for positions. So they'll say, oh, the apologists argue for things that are a minority in biblical or historical scholarship. Yet Protestants themselves will embrace things that are a minority in biblical and historical scholarship. Many of them will embrace Paul having written all of the epistles that are attributed to him, which is an unpopular view among a lot of biblical scholars. They will embrace Michael Kruger's self-authenticating model of the canon. Michael Kruger is a Protestant scholar, and he's got a way to try to show that we can know what the canon is without the church, a self-authenticating model. But Kruger admits in his own book, yeah, my model of the canon is the minority among historical scholars of this subject. Yet Protestants will embrace it and say, oh, well, Kruger is not allowing himself to be led by the naturalistic assumptions of the academy. Okay, so you'll do that so when someone has scholarship that supports you that's in the minority, he's just a scholar who doesn't let naturalistic assumptions get in his way. But when you have Catholic scholars, including, who argue for minority views and scholarship that are favorable to Catholicism, suddenly they're unscholarly apologists. So I find that to be quite the galling double standard there.
Yeah. And was it Richard Carrier? I mean, he basically built his career on counting on all the fringe theologians and stitching them together. I can't remember if it was Carrier.
Right. Well, speaking of stitching theologians together, you have another double standard with asking for dissenting scholarship. So I remember once James White was debating Shabir Ali, the Muslim apologist. Oh, yeah. And so they're debating, the reliability of the New Testament. And so it's fascinating. Here is what, so in the debate, White says that Shabir Ali has adopted the most radically liberal, skeptical, naturalistic sources as the mainstream of Christian scholarship, but uses the most conservative forms of scholarship to defend the Quran. And so that's it. That's the same thing, right? That Protestants will use the most liberal sources to attack Catholicism and the most conservative sources to defend Protestantism. So they do the same thing. And so later in a letter to Ali, White said this. He said Shabir Ali, his reliance on the Jerome Biblical Commentary, Raymond Brown, and other notorious liberals who have no concept of allowing Scripture to speak for itself, no concept of the unity and consistency you asserted for in the Quran, there remains and always will be his or your Achilles heel. And to me, that is just rich coming from someone like White to criticize Shabir Ali for using the Jerome Biblical Commentary when that is White's go-to text whenever he debates the subject of purgatory with Catholic apologists or goes to Raymond Brown. So you'll have Protestants who cite Father John Meyer and Raymond Brown who are skeptical of Mary's perpetual virginity. But they don't realize those same scholars are also skeptical of the virgin birth itself. And yet they would dismiss a Muslim who cited them on that subject. So it's just patently absurd to me. You'll cite these same scholars you'll dismiss when they argue against standard Protestant views like the virgin birth, but you're happy to use them against things like the perpetual virginity of Mary.
Yeah, and in fact, a more antiquated example of that, and you'll have to help me on the title, is it The Two Babylons by Hyssop?
Yeah, Alexander Hislop, the two Babylons, the system of Romanism. It has like the 19th century, every title has like 25 words in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he tries to make these comparisons between paganism and various Catholic things, but in the book he's also anti-Trinitarian, and yet you have Trinitarian Protestants citing this book against Catholicism.
Yeah, so originally the book was a pamphlet published in 1853, because I have a chapter 4 of my book, Pushing Parallelomania. That's a classic example. This is one of the most classic examples going back 200 years that you'll have Protestants will tell Catholics, oh, Mary worship, that's paganism. Look, it's just like how ancient pagans would venerate goddesses. So Catholicism is pagan, and Catholicism, the Eucharist or confession, it's just like this stuff practiced in ancient Babylon, which it actually was not. This is bad historical scholarship. So Hislop did this in 1853, a book called The Two Babylons, Romanism and Its Origins. After he died in 1903, it was reworked. It's been through like 7 editions, turned into a longer book. Then there was another author, I think back in 1966, Ralph Woodrow. Oh, yeah. He adapted Hislop, because Hislop's work is very difficult to read. So Woodrow condensed it into a book called Babylon Mystery Religion. But then later Woodrow realized Hislop's scholarship was totally wrong. So he pulled the book and wrote a corrective book called The Babylon Connection in 1997 to show all of these things, saying, look, if you argue this way, saying, oh, it's just the same as Catholicism is just like ancient paganism, that's what atheists do. They'll say, oh, look, Christianity is just like how ancient pagans worshipped dying and rising gods and, had worshipped men who were gods who performed miracles and turned water into wine. It is the exact same thing if you run that course. And you're right that Hislop, he did the same thing. Like he said, yeah, Catholic customs, they're pagan. He said Easter is pagan, that it's based on a Babylonian deity. We shouldn't celebrate Easter. It's Ishtar, which is silly because most non-English languages refer to Easter as Pascha or Paschal. That's like in my Eastern church I go to, we don't call it Easter, we call it Pascha. But you're right that this once again is a standard that erodes Christianity itself.
Yeah. Not only that, but also it's funny how they turned a blind eye to the fact that he was actually saying that the Trinity was of pagan origin.
Right. Yeah.
And you have Christian publishers or distributors who would have this book in their bookshelves.
And I'll be honest with you, it's because they heard good things about it and no one's ever read it through entirely, because it's just a difficult read because it's clunky. It's not sourced very well. But a lot of Hislop's research lived on in Woodrow and honestly in Jack Chick tracts. A lot of those arguments were just put into Chick tracts, basically.
Also, Trent, in the book, you treat Catholics that we have to be careful not to fall into the same problem.
Right. So as I go through each of these points, I try to say, okay, do Catholics ever argue like atheists in this respect? So, for example, when Protestants will criticize Catholicism by pointing to Catholics in the past committing acts of violence against Protestants. That's really no different than when atheists point out when Catholics or Protestants or Christians committed acts of violence, unjust elements of the Crusades, for example. Not that all of the Crusades were unjust, but there were certainly unjust actors within the Crusades or other acts of violence that, they'll point this out. It's the same kind of thing. And so Catholics can do this as well. They'll point out, oh, look at Martin Luther. Protestantism is so bad because Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. Look at the horrible things that he wrote. And he did write horrible things about Jewish people. But then again, some of the church fathers wrote horrible things about Jewish people. So that doesn't disprove their belief system just because they engaged in anti-Semitism, for example. When you critique others, you must always be ready. Well, it's what Jesus says, right, in the Gospels. The measure with which you measure shall be measured out to you. So it's fine to critique other people. So some people have gotten on my case saying, oh, so Trent, you're saying Protestants can't call out the Apocrypha for having errors, do you never call out the Quran or the Book of Mormon for having errors because you don't want to argue like an atheist? And I'll say, in many cases, yes, I will give a Muslim or a Mormon similar latitude with their holy book. Like maybe it's non-literal, maybe it's symbolic. I'll give them the same latitude I'd want them to give me. I still think there are important differences. For example, there's a qualitative difference between the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Like if you give a Jewish scholar, a Protestant, a Catholic, and an atheist scholar, those four scholars, the Bible, they could come up with a rough map of where these events allegedly took place. They might disagree about whether miracles happened, but they can come up with a rough map and show you which part of the world this stuff allegedly happened, regardless of who you give it to. You can't do that with the Book of Mormon. Mormons don't even agree on whether it took place in Central America, North and South America, the Great Lakes, the U.S. heartland, all over the map, which is kind of indicative of something that's not from a historical source, but from a story that was recited, after the fact, a story that was made up essentially. But this, of course, is not about Mormonism. It's about Catholics and Protestants acting like atheists. But that's something that I've tried to watch out for.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the Quran too, their understanding of inspiration, it's the literal dictation of Allah, which is very different from the Bible. So I think finding contradictions in that would probably be a different venture than something that has human agency.
That's right. So yeah, another thing that I point out are, you mentioned this earlier, conspiracy theories. So it's so funny that I noticed this one, that Constantine, the chapter is actually called Constantine Conspiracy Theories, because they're quite constant. That it's Emperor Constantine created Christianity. So you have Protestants who will say Constantine changed what was originally the pure, essentially proto-Protestant faith, and in 320, in 313, 325, depending on who you ask, he turned it into unbiblical Catholicism. And so he's to blame, and Catholicism emerged 4 centuries later. It's not part of the faith of the apostles. But this is the same argument that atheists make, or that's the same argument of the Da Vinci Code, that the Da Vinci Code said, oh yeah, the first Christians did not believe Jesus was God. They believed he was just a normal teacher. Constantine invented Christianity in the 4th century. And so you'll have atheists and others who make this argument. So how do you respond? Well, Protestants will say that's not right, because you can find evidence before Constantine of Christian beliefs, like belief in the deity of Christ. Well, that's the same way as a Catholic to overcome the argument. You can find evidence before Constantine of Christians believing in distinctly Catholic doctrines, writings among the ante-Nicene church fathers. So it's important to find that. For this one, I noticed that the parallel, what happens to Protestants and atheists happens to Catholics too sometimes. Protestants and atheists will say, look, this is an inconvenient fact that you have early sources believing in the resurrection of Christ and his divinity. What caused them to believe this? That's an inconvenient fact for an atheist to explain. The earliest sources affirm this. Maybe it's just a conspiracy and it never happened. For Protestants, it's an inconvenient fact. The early church fathers affirm Catholic doctrines. Maybe it was actually just Constantine and these are forgeries, and just get rid of the inconvenient facts of the conspiracy. And I think some Catholics do this too. That they'll say that when you compare the Second Vatican Council to prior to the council, there is a development in doctrine that is uncomfortable, understanding things like religious liberty, for example, and the relationship with non-Christian religions. And that's uncomfortable to face. But instead of doing the hard work of understanding how an authentic development took place, you just get a conspiracy to say, oh, well, the Second Vatican Council wasn't legitimate, and that's a fake church that came out of it, and it was a conspiracy to replace the real church that still exists out there. And so you'll have these, just as Protestants and atheists have these outlandish conspiracy theories with Constantine, Catholics will say, Sister Lucia, one of the visionaries from Fatima, was replaced with a look-alike. Pope John Paul I was murdered to prevent him from restoring the Latin Mass. And it starts to say, okay, maybe we're kind of grasping at straws and we should just face the facts in front of us and whatever uncomfortable conclusion they'll lead us to.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. We have to be careful not to fall into this same kind of, reaction, I guess, like rationalization of things that we don't like. You mentioned something earlier, so I'm just going to throw this out, Trent, because the idea of appealing to liberal scholars when they agree with you. Now, I know myself and others, we've done the same thing, though. For example, I appealed to Oscar Kuhlman's article in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament on Petros Petra, right?
Right.
But Kuhlman, if you read his writings, he has a lot of conclusions that I think it would not be considered conservative, right? So are we guilty of the same thing doing that?
Yeah, we have to be careful. I do mention this in my book. Like I cite, for example, this is a bit of a harder one that I think can happen inadvertently. So like I cite in my book how Peter Enns is a Protestant. And when you see some of the things he says about the Bible and its insufficiency to do formal theology, for example, he sounds a lot like a Catholic. But most Protestant evangelicals, at least, are very suspicious of Peter Enns. They would consider him more of a progressive. They don't consider him to have a very high view of Scripture. So they wouldn't be as open to it. So that's why when I cite Protestant sources whose scholarship backs up Catholic doctrine, I do try to find the most conservative scholars that I can, or at least the most trusted scholars. So it's a spectrum, right? Like, for example, on the papacy, I've quoted Coleman as well, but I also quote D.A. Carson, who's highly respected among evangelicals. I'll quote F.F. Bruce, for example. Others are a bit more, it's kind of a halfway point. Like, I know a lot of evangelicals are not a fan of N.T. Wright, but they still consider him a very well-researched and thoughtful scholar. And so they hold his scholarship in high regard, which is why I also quote Wright in my book, The Case for Catholicism. And this can be difficult where if you quote someone who is esteemed among Protestants, they're just well known and they're esteemed, you may not also know about some of their other odder conclusions that they hold. So it's a little bit of a tightrope walk. I think that it's most blatant, though, like in the example I quote in my book from White, when you have a specific scholar like Raymond Brown, that you criticize people who cite him against you, but then you use that same person in order to argue your own case. So like for yourself, Gary, it's not like in your books, you're writing Catholic apologetics, someone quotes Oscar Coleman, and you say, guys, come on, Oscar Coleman's a total liberal scholar. Why are you even going up that tree? And then you turn around and cite him yourself. You don't do that. I don't do that. So I think it's very different in that respect.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. That's why I love talking to you, Trent. You get the gears moving, make me think.
Sure.
Hey, well, we have a couple of minutes left, and before we close out, I wanted to ask you, like, what have you been up to? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your podcast and other things you're working on.
Well, so I still have the podcast going. Love people to check that out. I do 3 episodes a week. 2 on theology, 1 on miscellaneous on Fridays. And that's available on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube, the Council of Trent podcast. I'm finishing up. I have a book right now about 70% done called Confusion in the Kingdom, a critique of progressive Catholicism. So it's a critique of people like, Father James Martin and others who they're not outright dissenters, but they say things that are very ambiguous that cause confusion for people. And so I'm hoping to have that book hopefully done in the next few months. And then after that, it's just more research projects, the podcast. Hopefully we'll do a few. I just got done my debate with Gavin Ortlund, maybe further debates and dialogues, but it's all been very fruitful. I feel very blessed and hope the podcasts and the books are helping a lot of people. Yeah,
absolutely. It's great stuff. I listen to it whenever I can. And I think the book hopefully will come out pretty quick, especially with all the stuff with the German Bishops Conference.
Yes, there's never a shortage of things to discuss, but that one, honestly, a lot of them are just outright dissenters. That might be a subject for an entirely different book at some point, but there's others who are ambiguous about aspects of our faith. They'll talk about how, you shouldn't fire a teacher who marries a man because are you going to fire teachers that use contraception? It's like, are you going to fire the Presbyterian teachers? That's the Father James Martin says that a lot. And to show how these secondary issues, they confuse people and how we actually do have clear answers on them and help people understand what the church, really teaches in this regard.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. Any debates up on the docket?
Not yet. I just cleared the one with Gavin. I'm open to other debates. I know some people have been critical of me, and I've offered the olive branch to debate or dialogue with them. Not yet, but just definitely do a lot of work through, and who knows? I'm happy to keep the door open to engage others on that.
Awesome. Well, keep up the great work, my friend. I appreciate it, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Trent Horn, check out the book. I think you'll love it. It's When Protestants Argue Like Atheists. It's available at shop.catholic.com. Just go on Catholic Answers website. Pick up a copy for your friend.